There is a moment, somewhere deep inside a criminal empire, where the most powerful fighter alive stands across from a boy who should already be dead. The man's eyes are silver, one of them, the kind of eye that sees through lies, through masks, through the careful performances people build to survive in a world like this. He has used that eye to unmask traitors, to break confessions from men who swore they would never speak. The martial world calls him the first disciple, and among the ranks of killers and warlords and ancient monsters who make up the Heaven and Earth Association, even that title carries weight enough to silence a room. He looked at the boy, and something happened that had never happened before. He was afraid. Not the ordinary fear a strong man feels when he meets a stronger one. Something older. Something the body remembers before the mind has words for it. The instinct that fires when a creature realizes it is standing too close to something that should not exist. The silver eye, which had never lied to him, saw past the boy's calm face and into whatever lived behind it. And the first disciple did not wait to understand what he saw. He attacked. What came next? The boy himself barely survived. But he did survive. And when it was over, when the first disciple lay on the ground with one eye socket empty and his body burning with a poison it could not process, the boy stood above him and made a choice that surprised even the people watching. He decided not to kill him. Not because he was merciful. He is not built for mercy. He decided because killing the first disciple would bring consequences he was not yet ready to face. He was playing a longer game, had been playing it since the day his grandfather's body was found cut in two in the ashes of a burned farmhouse, and a 16-year-old boy with no martial arts training and a mind like a steel trap said a single word, picked up what he needed, and walked out to start dismantling the people responsible. That word was damn, not a cry, not a vow of vengeance. One flat syllable, standing over the only person he had ever loved. That was the whole of it. The grief, the fury, the promise. Everything compressed into a boy who did not know how to feel things the normal way, and never had. To understand how a boy like that ends up defeating one of the association's most feared fighters, you have to go back much further. Back to a prisoner carriage on a dusty road. Back to a child the locals called the Scythe Killer Demon. Because when the bodies were found, the cuts were too clean and too precise for anyone to believe a child's hands were responsible. Back to the beginning. He was arrested at 16. 2 soldiers, a wooden carriage with bars. The kind of transport used for men the authorities wanted to keep alive long enough to reach a city and face formal punishment. He sat in it with his hands bound, watching the road through the gaps in the wood, and he was calm in the way that unnerves people. Not the calm of someone who has made peace with his situation, but the calm of someone who is already thinking 3 moves ahead. He had been living in the mountains with his grandfather, gathering herbs, testing poisons on himself since he was small. His grandfather was not a martial artist. He was a scholar who knew too many things. Medicine, poison, the old texts, several languages that most people in this world had never heard spoken aloud. Persian was one of them. The boy learned it without being asked, the same way he learned everything. He heard it once and it stayed. Every word, every structure, every idiom his grandfather used when he thought the boy was not listening. The grandfather knew what the boy was. He had figured it out early, the way you figure out a fire is dangerous. Not by being told, but by getting close enough to feel the heat. He never told the boy he was wrong for what he was. He told the boy to hold it, to keep it inside. He gave the boy a name that meant righteousness, which was the name of a hope, not a description. And he spent 15 years hoping the hope would be enough. It was not enough. But it was the only thing that ever came close to being enough, and the boy knew it. On the road in the carriage, he resisted the sleeping drug they put in his food. His body had processed enough poisons by then to simply metabolize it, and he sat awake in the dark while the other prisoners slept, and he thought. A man had been watching from an inn window as the carriage passed. Not a soldier, not a villager. A fixer. The kind of man who makes problems disappear and arrangements happen for people with money and nowhere else to go. He had been looking for a specific body type, a specific age, a specific degree of disposability. He found it in the carriage. The job was simple in its outline. The third young master of Mocksword Manor needed to not exist for a while. He was soft, pampered, hated the political games of his family, and had decided to vanish. Someone had to take his place. Someone who looked roughly right, who was young enough to be moldable and desperate enough not to ask too many questions. The fixer pulled strings and had the boy transferred to a holding cell in the city, where the real third young master was also waiting. What the fixer did not know, what Guard Cam, who ran the scheme, did not know, was that the boy they had chosen was not desperate. He was not moldable. He was sitting in that jail cell reading the situation the way a physician reads a body, looking for where the weakness was, where the pressure point was, where the whole structure would come apart if you pushed correctly. The real third young master's name was Jong Un-mulk. He came into the cell carrying food. Good food, the kind that means someone is trying to buy goodwill, and he sat across from the boy and made his offer. He would provide servants, gold, resources, a comfortable life inside the manor, if the boy played the role. A poison pill had been placed inside the boy's body as insurance, to be dissolved only when the impersonation was complete. A leash. Jong Un-mulk seemed to think this was a generous arrangement. He smiled when he said it. The boy took the food, ate it, and agreed. Then he was released. And in the minutes between the prison gate and the carriage waiting outside, in a moment with no witnesses and no record, he killed Jong Un-mulk. Not out of rage. He explained it later to Guard Cam with the patient logic of a man who found it faintly strange that the conclusion was not obvious. A person who knew his real identity and had every reason to eventually reveal it was a liability. Liabilities get eliminated. It was not personal. It was arithmetic. Guard Cam did not kill him. He could not. The poison pill was already inside the boy, and its antidote was the only leverage the scheme had left. So they arrived at Mocksword Manor with a fake third young master who had already demonstrated, in the first 10 minutes of the arrangement, that he would kill anyone he considered a loose end. Guard Cam left a watcher. A man named Gochan, a retired assassin, weathered and quiet, put in place to monitor the boy and report back. The kind of man who has done enough dirty work to be useful, and not enough of it to have any illusions left. He expected a soft, frightened child who needed minding. He found something that studied him for 3 days, said almost nothing, and then held a blade to his wrist and said, quite calmly, that Gochan's blood would poison him if it got into a wound, so Gochan could tell him what he wanted to know, or Gochan could find out what the blood actually tasted like. Gochan told him what he wanted to know. He learned that Mocksword Manor had 4 young masters. The first was the manor lord's eldest, drunk, vicious, useful for nothing. The second was clever and political, and already running schemes with Guard Cam behind everyone's back. The fourth was a martial arts genius who had reached the Ascendant Realm at 16, which was a thing that almost never happened, and who was the manor lord's actual favorite. His name was Yu-chan, and he was everything the boy was not. Trained, disciplined, talented, with a future already mapped out for him. And the boy had no martial arts at all, 0 training, a poisoned body, a photographic memory, 2 languages no one nearby spoke, and an ability to calculate outcomes that most people would call ruthless and he would call obvious. He was standing inside a political nest of scheming relatives, a suspicious hallmaster, a manor lord who was sick with something no ordinary physician could identify, and a watcher reporting his every move to a man who planned to use him as a disposable prop. He did not find this alarming. He found it interesting. The manor lord's illness was the first thing he investigated. It was not natural. It had the texture of something cultivated, something placed there deliberately. The first lady, who was the second young master's mother and a capable martial artist in her own right, had brought a shaman to treat it in secret, a man called Mosin, who worked in the realm where the living and the dead intersect, and who had his own reasons for wanting access to whatever lay beneath the manor lord's body. The boy interrupted the ritual. He arrived with Gochan, read what was happening in seconds, and did what he calculated was necessary. He cut off the manor lord's arms, both of them. Not out of cruelty. It was the fastest way to sever the energy transfer before it completed. The manor lord screamed. The first lady's men scrambled. And the shaman, suddenly very much at a disadvantage, found a sword at his throat and a boy asking him, in an extremely reasonable tone, where the manor's secret manual and its seal were kept. The shaman tried the obvious escape. He summoned an evil spirit to possess the boy, a technique that should have put a trained fighter on his knees. It found, inside the boy, something it had not expected to find. A space, a room behind a locked door, and whatever lived there was not the boy's ordinary self. It was something older and colder that looked back at the spirit with a patience that had no bottom to it. The spirit chose, wisely, to retreat. The boy forced the shaman to call the spirit into a vessel instead, extracted the location of the manual and the seal, then fed the shaman to his own spirit, which was not something the shaman had anticipated when he accepted this job. He stabbed himself in the leg afterward, and Go-chan's leg, light wounds, enough to bleed convincingly. When the outer hall master arrived, he found 2 injured young men and a dead shaman, which was almost a story that made sense if you didn't think about it too carefully. The hallmaster's name was Sang, and he was the most rigorous person in the manor, the kind of man who filed everything correctly and suspected everyone reasonably and trusted nothing he had not personally verified. He looked at the scene, looked at the boy, and filed it under "requires more observation." The medicinal hall they sent the boy to recover in happened to have access to the underground passages where the manual and seal were hidden. Nobody planned it that way. The boy noticed it was possible, and that was sufficient. The First Lady came to him before he could go looking. She pressed his wound, literally pressed it with her finger, leaning close, watching his face for the flinch that would confirm he was faking, and called him a liar. She was not wrong, but she was not entirely right either, and he did not flinch because pain had never been the kind of thing that surprised him. He summoned Demonic Monk instead. The Demonic Monk was a yellow-ranked grudge spirit, a dead man's fury given shape, bound to the boy by a kind of adoption neither of them had formally agreed to. It possessed the First Lady's guard. The guard turned. And the boy, from his sickbed, negotiated from a position that had not existed 60 seconds earlier. The First Lady left furious. She hired the Phoenix Pavilion, a shaman assassin organization, the professional kind, expensive and discreet, to kill him. A talent-ranked shaman named New Moon came to the manor with a mountain-piercing chamorro, a beast spirit large enough to crack stone, and a technique called reverse murder that turned a victim's own energy into a weapon against them. She encountered Alaris. The blue spirit had been locked in a human skin book beneath the manor's underground chambers for a very long time. She was not in good temper. She was blue-ranked, a level of power that put her far above anything the First Lady or the Phoenix Pavilion had been prepared for, and she had not chosen to be the boy's familiar spirit so much as been maneuvered into it by a 16-year-old who understood enough about spirit contracts to know that if he swallowed a piece of her vessel, she could not let him die without losing her anchor. She destroyed New Moon's attack, found her, and the boy stood in front of the shaman with an expression of helpful regret and explained that she had 2 choices. She could publicly name the First Lady as the person who hired her, or she could find out what Alaris did next. New Moon named the First Lady in front of witnesses. Then Alaris killed her privately, because the blue spirit was not interested in leaving loose ends either. The boy spent the next night memorizing every page of the secret manual. He sat in the underground chamber with the book open across his knees, turning pages in the dark, and when he was finished, he burned it. Watched the ash settle, then he made 2 copies, both wrong, both subtly poisoned with errors no untrained reader would catch, errors that would corrupt the techniques of anyone who tried to learn from them. 1 copy went to the First Lady. 1 went to the second young master. Let them fight over a trap. Guard Cam came back. He had made his choice by then. He was the second young master's man now, had decided the winning side was obvious, and arrived at the manor with the confidence of someone who believed the boy had no moves left. The poison pill was still inside him. The real third young master was dead, but only Guard Cam knew that, and Guard Cam had decided that information was leverage enough to do whatever he wanted. What he wanted was the boy's head. A clean offering to the second young master, proof of loyalty, a stepping stone to something better than being a fixer for a scheme that had already outlived its usefulness. He had not accounted for what the boy had learned in the underground chamber. The thoughts-shattering 8 techniques were a shaman's martial system, 8 rituals, each with combat applications that turned ordinary spiritual awareness into something weaponized. The boy had read about the first one, the ritual of attachment, and spent a week practicing it on Guard Cam's corpse after the man was dead. He was getting ahead of himself, but only slightly. Guard Cam raised his hand. The boy raised his. And, through the ritual of attachment, which pulls, which draws inward, which treats the energy inside another person as a rope to be gripped and yanked, he drained the internal energy from Guard Cam's body in a sustained flow, like water leaving a basin. Guard Cam did not understand what was happening to him until his legs stopped working. By then the boy was close enough, and he pressed his palm against the cut he had reopened on his own arm, the wound he had been refreshing every few days, keeping it viable, and let the blood make contact. Poison blood, raised on toxins since childhood. His body had metabolized enough death that what flowed in his veins was not safe for a normal person to touch, let alone absorb through an open wound in a hand already weakened by energy drain. GuardCam's system recognized it too late. He begged. The source doesn't record what he said exactly, but men in his position tend to offer things. Information, loyalty, anything. And the boy listened with the same expression he used for everything. Attentive, patient, faintly curious. Then he used GuardCam's own dagger. Go-chan watched this. He had been watching the boy for weeks now, assigned to report his movements, and somewhere in that time the assignment had stopped being the point. The boy never thanked him. He did not give speeches about loyalty or make promises about futures. What he did was look at Go-chan like Go-chan was a person worth accounting for, which was rarer than it sounds for a man who had spent his life being used and discarded by people with more power. Go-chan started reporting selectively, then stopped reporting entirely. He did not announce this change. He simply made it, and the boy noticed, and neither of them mentioned it. The outer hall master Sang was harder. Sang had been watching the boy since the shaman incident with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to trust patterns. The boy's patterns were wrong. His mannerisms were off. The real Mok Jung-won, the third young master, had been to this manor as a child. He would have known which hallways sloped, which doors stuck, which servants had been there long enough to expect to be recognized. The boy knew none of these things. He had filled the gaps with confidence, which fooled people who were looking for hesitation. But it did not fool Sang, who was looking for something more precise. Sang sealed his meridians, a technique that used life energy to block the channels through which a martial artist's power flowed, effective against anyone who fought using internal energy in the conventional way. The boy stood, which he should not have been able to do, and walked out of the room, which was physically impossible for a person whose meridians had been sealed. Sang did not have a category for what he was seeing. The explanation was the death energy core. The boy's body ran on something that was not life energy at all, something that sat in a different channel, something no acupuncture technique was calibrated to reach, because no one had ever needed to calibrate for it before. A living person holding death energy had never existed. Sang's technique was perfect. It simply addressed the wrong system entirely. Demonic Monk did the rest. The yellow-ranked spirit slid into Sang's body. The hallmaster's eyes went briefly wrong, the way eyes go when the person behind them has been temporarily replaced. And through Sang's own hands and Sang's own authority, the boy arranged whatever he needed arranged, and Sang bowed to Go-chan, which was not a thing Sang would have done if given any choice in the matter. The fourth young master found him next. Yu-chan, the mock brother, was 16, the same age as the boy, and had reached the ascendant realm through genuine effort and genuine talent. He was not stupid. He had seen enough of the boy's maneuvering to understand that the third young master he was dealing with was not the person he was supposed to be, but he was also practical enough to recognize that understanding and proving are different problems. He came with the secret manual, his copy, the fake, as leverage. The boy traded him lessons, basic martial arts foundations, the kind of groundwork a self-taught genius still needed, in exchange for the manual. Yu-chan accepted. He practiced. He worked at it with the focused intensity of someone who believes completely in the thing they are doing, and the boy watched him practice and made a private note about which muscles were developing, which pathways were reinforcing, what the altered technique was building toward in a body that trained hard enough to actualize it. He had changed the manual's core sequence every 13 or 14 characters. Not randomly, deliberately, with a specific outcome in mind. He was curious what would happen when someone with genuine martial arts talent ran the corrupted version long enough for it to fully express. He would find out later, in a way he had not entirely predicted. The body under the manor lord's bed. He found it while searching the underground chambers for the manual. A man, dead and dried, tucked into a crevice with the care of something hidden rather than something discarded. The wound was distinctive. A single cut, lateral, at a precise angle, clean enough that the body had barely bled before the heart stopped. The kind of cut that required not just skill, but a very specific technique. A signature. whether the person making it knew they were signing or not. He had seen that wound before. On his grandfather, the same angle, the same depth, the same almost surgical precision that meant the person who made it had made it many times. He stood in the dark for a moment with his hand near but not touching the dried edge of the wound, and the flat place in him where grief was supposed to live was quiet, and what moved instead was something colder and more useful. He had a name now, not a full identity, not yet, but a category: Ghostblade. One of the 8 stars of the martial world, a swordsman whose technique left that mark. His grandfather had been killed by someone worth finding, someone with a location, someone who had reason enough to kill an old herbalist living in the mountains, that the reason itself was a thread to pull. He filed it. The fire that was not grief burned steadily at some low temperature that never went out and never got in the way. Then the Heaven and Earth Association arrived. 3 of them came to the manor. Sun Yun, a man of considerable institutional authority within the association. The Bright Blade King, one of the 5 kings, which meant one of the 8-star fighters who made up the association's true power tier, a level so high it left most martial artists in this world simply hoping not to be noticed. And a shaman from the Underworld Pavilion, the association's internal spirit organization, who had noticed something interesting about the boy's eyes during the trial proceedings. They had come for a treasure, the human skin book. The thing that had held Alaris for however long she had been locked in it was an association artifact, and someone had taken it from them, and the trail led to Mock Sword Manor. The manor lord produced what he said was the location. They opened the box. Empty. The boy was standing nearby, watching the Bright Blade King's face, and in the half-second before the king controlled his expression, the boy read everything he needed to know about how seriously these people took what had been taken. The book was not just valuable. It was significant in a way that had to do with history the boy did not yet fully know, and Alaris, sealed beside him in an invisible contract, watching from behind his eyes, went very still. Into the empty box, from a position of absolute innocence, the boy placed the First Lady's earrings. He had taken them earlier with the specific purpose of having something to leave somewhere inconvenient. He had been carrying them for weeks, patient as a man waiting for the right door to open. The earrings gleamed in the torchlight. The First Lady's face changed. The association shaman looked at the boy during the subsequent chaos. The First Lady's protests, the manor lord's confusion, the second young master's careful political maneuvering to stay out of it, and he looked specifically at the boy's eyes. Eyes that could see spirits clearly without training. A born gift, extremely rare, the kind of thing a shaman organization would very much want access to. He wanted the boy as his disciple. The boy said, politely, that he appreciated the offer. Then he demonstrated that he had memorized the book, the one they thought was lost, by reciting portions of it while performing movements he had learned from Alaris, who was careful to conceal the fact that she was teaching him. What came out of the boy's mouth was the Moon Vein Sword Scripture, a text the association had believed destroyed or lost for a century. Sun Yun's expression went through several changes in quick succession, none of them comfortable. The boy stopped mid-recitation. He pressed a blade to his own throat. He said, with the same reasonable calm he brought to everything, that if they tried to take the knowledge by force, they would find it considerably harder to retrieve from a corpse. It was not a bluff. Everyone present understood it was not a bluff, because the boy had the specific quality of someone who has already done the arithmetic and found the outcome acceptable. Sun Yun stopped him. They negotiated. The boy proposed an arrangement that framed itself as voluntary. He would come with them to the association as a guest, officially as a hostage from the manor, a traditional enough arrangement in the martial world's political grammar. In reality, he had calculated that the path to Ghostblade led through the association, that the association leader was the one person confirmed to know Ghostblade's identity, and that being inside the compound with institutional cover was better than trying to approach from outside. He let them take him. In the carriage, his hands were bound. He spent 20 minutes using the ritual of attachment on the rope, drawing the fibers toward him, relaxing them, working them loose from the inside with energy manipulation instead of physical effort. When his hands were free, he turned to the other hostage, Yuchan, the 4th young master, the mock brother. He was in the carriage for the opposite reason, as a genuine prize, a recognized martial prodigy the association wanted to study and potentially recruit. He looked at the boy's suddenly unbound hands, with an expression that was not surprise, so much as resigned confirmation of a suspicion he had been carrying for weeks. The boy asked him about the association, specifically about the leader, specifically about anyone who might be connected to a swordsman called Ghostblade. Yuchan did not know much. He was 16 and had spent most of his life in a manor. But what he knew, he gave, because by this point he understood that the person across from him was someone who collected information the way other people collected weapons, and it was probably wiser to be useful. The association shaman, Master Zhao, tried his own test in the carriage, an illusion, a good one. The boy found himself somewhere that looked real, that felt real, where the sensory details were precise and layered and designed to hold a person for hours while the shaman learned what he needed to know. The boy was inside it for less than 4 minutes. He noticed the blood tasted wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way, wrong in the specific way of something synthesized rather than real, a quality his poison-trained body recognized before his conscious mind had finished asking the question. He pushed on the edges of the illusion methodically, the way you check a room for hidden doors, and found the seam where the constructed world joined the real one, and walked through it. Master Zhao was waiting on the other side with an impressed expression and an offer. The cursed oath beads came out of his robe. 4 of them in the world, made by a Dharma master. Artifacts that bound whoever swore on them to obey whoever they swore to, using the name given at the time of the oath. Break the contract, and the backlash was severe enough to matter. Zhao wanted a disciple, and more than that, he wanted an asset he could trust not to run. The boy held the beads and swore. He used a false name, not his real one, not any name he had given to anyone at the manor, a name he invented in the moment, a name that had no connection to who he was or where he came from. The oath bound whoever he said he was. He was not technically that person. The beads did not know the difference. He slipped them off his wrist afterward and handed them back with a cooperative expression, and Master Zhao secured them, satisfied, believing he had just acquired a very promising disciple with a very useful set of skills. Alaris said something sharp to him that night in the quiet space between sleep and attention where she could speak to him without a vessel. He listened, and then said he had agreed to help her with her own revenge against the association, which was a different matter, and what were the terms. They argued about terms for a while. She was contemptuous in the way of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has developed opinions about being managed by 16-year-olds. He was patient in the way of someone who understood that contempt was not the same as refusal. They arrived at an agreement. She would teach him 2 of the 8 shaman techniques in exchange for his help with her unfinished business, which she was not yet ready to explain in full, and which he agreed not to push on, yet. He agreed to become her disciple. She agreed to teach him. She was not happy about either part of this arrangement, but she honored it, because whatever else Alaris was, she was not someone who made agreements she did not intend to keep. The carriage arrived at Corpse Blood Valley. Corpse Blood Valley earned its name. The cliffs around it were the color of old rust, stained by something that was not mineral, and the air had a particular quality that veteran fighters recognized and younger ones pretended not to notice. The Heaven and Earth Association used this place to select new members, not through examination or recommendation, but through the simplest possible filter: survival. The first trial was the marble. Every candidate received one. A small stone, unremarkable, except that possessing it when the trial ended was the only condition for passing. The rule was equally simple: no rules. You could take someone else's marble. You could hide yours. You could form alliances, make promises, break them. The association did not care about your methods. It cared about outcomes, and the outcome it wanted was a room full of people who understood that the world did not reward hesitation. Most candidates spent the first minutes clustering, reading the room, calculating who looked dangerous and who could be managed. The boy spent those minutes finding the person most likely to be carrying their marble against their body, rather than in a pocket. A fighter near the back who kept touching the left side of his chest, the habit of a man checking something important. He crossed the room with a purpose that looked, from a distance, like someone moving toward the exit. He put his hand through the fighter's throat, not literally, close enough that it did not matter, a strike to the pressure point that made the hand go numb, and in the moment the man grabbed his own arm in surprise, the marble was already gone. The boy held it up, walked to the registration point, placed both marbles down and accepted the silver insignia of first place while the room was still deciding how it felt about what it had just seen. A few candidates laughed, nervous. A few others moved away from him without being conscious of doing it. The association officials watching from the observation platform noted the name he had given, Azareth, a name with no traceable origin, and wrote it down with the particular attention reserved for things that do not fit established patterns. Below the valley floor, past the holding areas and the dormitories carved into the cliff rock, there was a place the candidates were not supposed to go. The boy found it on the first evening, following a quality in the air that his death energy sensitivity registered before any other sense kicked in. A narrow passage, then a cliff face, and below it a pit. The pit was full of corpse spirits, hundreds of them, chained to the rock, their energy cultivated over years into a condensed poison that the association was growing for reasons the boy could guess at from the texture of it. The goo poison, the candidates called it in whispers, something cultivated from mass death, patient and slow and very, very dense. He looked at it for a while, calculating. Then he jumped in. The impact of the fall was the least interesting part. He went under, and the spirits, things that had been human once and were now something more diffuse and less coherent, surged toward the warmth of a living body the way cold things always move toward heat. They found, instead of the expected terror or the expected resistance, a death energy core that opened toward them like a mouth. He absorbed the goo poison from the inside, drank the cultivated death energy of hundreds of chained spirits in a sustained pull that took the better part of an hour, and among those spirits there was one that was more coherent than the rest, a man's consciousness that had survived the cultivation process with enough of itself intact to still be angry about it. His name was Saha. He fought the absorption and lost, and when it was over he was bound to the boy the same way demonic monk was bound, the same way Alaris was bound. Not by choice, but by the boy's particular talent for turning encounters into contracts. The boy climbed back out of the pit. He was smiling, which the two association guards who spotted him decided immediately they had not seen. He was also, now, at the apex of the ascendant realm. The death energy he had absorbed was dense enough to force his core to a threshold it had been approaching for weeks. He felt the shift the way you feel a key turn in a lock, a mechanical certainty, a before and after with no ambiguity about which side you are on. He told Saha, in the hours afterward while the spirit was still adjusting to the situation, that he could call himself Miran. Saha said he was a man. The boy acknowledged this. The spirit inhabiting the pit had been using the body of a woman as a vessel, an assassin who had died in the cliff, and Saha was now in that body, anchored there. He was, in every practical sense, Miran now, and the boy could hear, in the silences between his new familiar's protests, the specific misery of a man who has no good options and knows it. He was not unsympathetic. He was also not going to change the arrangement. The second trial was survival on the mountain. Teams were assigned. The candidates would climb, plant their flag at the summit, retrieve a sword, and descend. Simple enough except that a Chamorro beast was released into the terrain once the first group reached the tree line. And the association's idea of a Chamorro was not a guard dog. It was a thing that had been fed well and contained too long, and it moved through the forest the way a fire moves through dry grass. Fast, total, without particular interest in which direction the humans were running. The boy joined a team. His relationship to the team was purely mathematical. They were bodies, and bodies generate death energy when they die, and he needed the energy. He was honest with himself about this, if no one else. Most of the team did not finish the trial. He absorbed what they left behind. Demonic Monk handled the one who tried to hide and wait, slipping into the man's body long enough to redirect him into the open, and then vacating before anyone thought to ask why the man had walked in the wrong direction at the worst possible moment. By the time the boy reached the summit, his core was measurably denser, and the sword formation patterns carved into the flagpoles, which everyone else had treated as decoration, had been read and memorized. When the Chamorro found him, it was already dying. He did not fight it with technique or internal energy. He gripped its jaw and pulled, the same way he had been pulling things with the ritual of attachment for weeks, until the jaw gave. The beast's own momentum did the rest. He left it at the tree line and walked to registration with his flag and his insignia, and nobody who had watched it happen seemed to want to be the first to describe it aloud. Second place in the first trial, first in the second. He was building something, a a reputation with no comfortable category. The third trial was the sword formation. Teams would perform a coordinated sequence of techniques that the association used to test for synchronization, for the ability to read other fighters and respond in real time. It should have been the trial where a solo-oriented fighter struggled. The night before, the boy visited several competing teams. Not violently. He did not need to be violent about it. Legs break quietly if you know exactly where to press, and the pain takes a few hours to fully develop, and by morning, there were 6 candidates who could not stand and whose teammates were scrambling to reorganize around an absence. He was in his own bunk, apparently sleeping, when this was discovered. He had the specific quality of someone who is surprised to hear the news. His own team performed adequately. He was not the weakest member, which was the only metric he had assigned himself. When the trial ended in a technical standoff with another team, a fighter with sleepy eyes who was more perceptive than his affect suggested, who had noticed the boy watching his formation with the attention of someone cataloging rather than competing, they cooperated instead of fought. Both teams passed. The sleepy-eyed fighter, whose name was never given but whose calm matched the boy's in an unsettling way, looked at him for a moment longer than necessary after the handshake. The fourth trial required no killing. It required speed, a dark obstacle course, timed from start to finish, designed to take an average of 15% of a candle to complete. The record had stood for 11 years. He finished before 5%. He did not explain this afterward, and no one thought to ask. The death energy gave him a physical awareness of space that worked in the dark the same as in the light, an extension of his senses into the surrounding air, a kind of negative mapping that made obstacles visible as absences of energy rather than as objects. He moved through the course the way water moves downhill, finding the path not by looking for it, but by feeling where the resistance was least. After the fourth trial, he was the top-ranked candidate in Corpse Blood Valley's history. So was the Mock Brother. The final rankings showed 2 names at the peak, which had not happened before. The association officials reviewed the records twice, and came to the same conclusion twice, and the announcement caused the exact kind of institutional confusion that the boy had not planned for, but found satisfying anyway. The treasury visit came before the formal master selection. Top candidates received access to the association's library and treasury, a room carved deep into the cliff, lined with texts and manuals and artifacts from centuries of accumulation. Most candidates used their hours there to find 1 or 2 techniques that applied to their existing skill set and read carefully. The boy spent the first 2 hours standing in front of shelves at walking pace, reading the spine of every text in order, which from a distance looked like someone browsing without direction. He was photographing every title, every author notation, every index visible through a half-open cover, a complete inventory of what was here, organized in his memory by subject and by level of restriction. At the end of 2 hours, he had read more of the treasury than most members of the association ever would. Then he found the note. It was tucked inside a text on sword formations, pressed between pages that should have been blank. Alaris went very quiet when he pulled it out. The handwriting was hers, century-old brushwork, compressed and precise, in a style that matched the formal shaman notation he had been learning from her. It was a location cipher, and what it pointed to was a technique she had hidden here before whatever happened to her had happened. The moonless sword technique, one of the 5 great sword arts of the old martial world, a thing the association did not know they were housing. He sat down. He started reading. And somewhere in the first 30 lines, the text stopped being information he was processing and became something he was moving through. The technique had a structure that mapped directly onto his death energy, as if it had been designed for someone like him, or had been waiting for someone like him, and the lines between reading and experiencing began to dissolve. He did not notice the Brightblade King's disciple approaching from the other side of the treasury until the man was close enough that ignoring him required active effort. The man reached out to interrupt. His hand crossed the air between them, and the boy's response was not a decision, it was a reflex, the kind that bypasses reasoning entirely, and comes from whatever layer of the self existed before thinking was necessary. He moved, and the Brightblade King's disciple found himself several feet backward with a precise amount of pain in his wrist that suggested someone had measured the distance between stop and break. They stared at each other. A young woman intervened. The third disciple, one of the association leader's own 3 students, which made her one of the most politically significant people in the compound. She stepped between them with a calm that matched the boy's own, and held it there until the disciple chose to be somewhere else, which took longer than it should have because he was not a man accustomed to backing down. But she was not backing down either, and eventually the math resolved in her favor. She looked at the boy the way people look at something they are trying to classify. Her name was Wei Son. She was precise in her movements, careful in her observations, and she looked, in certain lighting and from certain angles, enough like Alaris that something shifted in the boy's expression. Not much, not in a way a stranger would catch, but enough that Alaris noticed and chose not to comment on. Wei Son handed him her name plaque, a small carved token, a formal marker of relationship in this world's etiquette, meaning she was claiming a connection to him, extending the protection of her name and her access. It was a significant gesture. It was also, possibly, a strategic one. She was smart enough to recognize that the person standing in front of her was going to be relevant to how the next few years went, and being connected to relevance was its own kind of power. He accepted it. He did not promise anything. She did not seem to expect promises. Then the sealed room at the back of the treasury made itself known. The door had been locked for over 1,000 years. The seal on it was old enough that the style of the warding script was from a tradition that no living shaman used, which meant it had been placed by someone who was either very old or very dead, and the intent behind it was containment rather than simple security. What was inside had been put there because someone wanted it to stay there. It noticed them. Not all at once, a gradual pressure, the way underground water makes itself felt through stone, until the seal began to flex in ways that the original warding had not accounted for. Wei Son moved toward the door to reinforce it, and the boy watched the seal's energy signature with his ghost eyes, reading the pattern of weakness the way he had read the Marble Trials room and the Manor's underground passages, as a problem with a specific structure that implied a specific solution. The Sacred Realm beast came through the gap before either of them could close it. 1,000-year-old Chamorro. Raccoon form, but the shape was incidental. At Sacred Realm, a Chamorro's form was mostly a habit rather than a constraint. Its power was the kind that made the surrounding air feel thin, the kind that caused competent fighters to instinctively step back without being fully aware they had moved. It came through the door in a rush of compressed presence, and it oriented immediately toward the nearest life energy, and it stopped. It had looked at the boy, and past the boy, into him, the way things with genuine power sometimes could, past the surface presentation to whatever lived at depth. It found the locked door, the thing behind the sealed room in the protagonist's own mind, the thing that had sent the shaman's evil spirit retreating, the thing the boy himself could not see or name. And the Sacred Realm beast, which had been sealed for a millennium and had fought beings the historical record described only as immortals, took one look at what was behind that door and chose, actively and with urgency, to go back. The boy caught it before it could fully retreat. Not with force, he held the frame of the door open with his death energy, filling the gap in the original seal with something the old warding had not expected to be used this way, and he looked at the beast at eye level and said, reasonably, that it could stay in the box if it preferred. He would seal it again. He was just going to need something in return. The beast looked at him, looked at the door, went back into the box. He resealed it. The warding held. The surrounding air returned to its normal weight, and Wei Son, who had watched this exchange with the expression of someone recalibrating several significant assumptions, said nothing for a long moment. Alaris was near destroyed. She had been pouring everything she had into a defensive barrier during the beast's emergence, trusting nothing about a Sacred Realm Chamorro's intentions toward a contractor she was still mostly annoyed by but had no intention of losing. Her energy was thin when it was over, the kind of thin that approaches a threshold, where what happens next is not recovery but dissolution. He did not deliberate. He opened what he was cultivating and gave her what she needed, the death energy, poured into her familiar bond, the kind of transfer that costs the giver in proportion to what the recipient requires. Except what came out of him was not quite death energy anymore. It had changed during the treasury session, during whatever the moonless sword technique had begun doing to his core. The color was wrong. Not the gray-blue of death energy, but something darker, something that had no name because no one had seen it before. Alaris absorbed it. The bond between them flared with a specific intensity that is only produced when one thing changes into something categorically different. She upgraded, from blue to indigo, a level above her previous peak, a level that made her something the Underworld Pavilion would have resources to compare to if the Underworld Pavilion had ever encountered anything like it, which it had not. She was quiet for a while afterward, not the contemptuous quiet she defaulted to, but something else, the quiet of a person reassessing a situation they thought they understood. He gave her time. The final duel rankings happened the next morning. The sleepy-eyed fighter came first among the boy's opponents, the only candidate who had consistently matched him in perception throughout the trials, who fought with an economy that suggested he was closer to the transcendent realm than any of his age should have been. They fought. The boy read his technique in the first exchange, adapted in the second, and finished in the third with a precision that the watching officials described in their notes as somehow instructive, which was not a word combination they had used before for a candidate's fighting style. Mock Brother fought Demonic Monk. This was not what either of them had expected. The demonic monk had taken a body for the trials, inhabiting a tattooed fighter who had died in the mountain trial, using it with the grudge spirit's particular brand of aggressive confidence. Yuchan fought him with everything he had, and in the crisis of the battle, when demonic monk had him cornered and the gap between them was not closable by talent or training alone, the altered martial art the boy had taught him found its full expression. The blood reversal technique developed by accident. Yuchan pushed his internal energy past the point the corrupted manual's sequence permitted, and the body's response to an impossible command was to do something the command had not intended: reverse the blood flow, tripling the available energy, at the cost of turning the veins black, and the pain exquisite, and the long-term consequences something to worry about later. He hit the demonic monk with it. The tattooed fighter's body took the full force and the wound it left was distinctive. The same angular precision as the cut on the Manor Lord's body, the same signature the boy had been carrying in his memory for months. He saw it from the observation area and said nothing. Filed it! Both candidates were named top graduates. Unprecedented. The association officials scheduled the master selection immediately, because having two top-ranked candidates simultaneously was a situation the rulebook addressed by moving quickly through the ceremony before anyone found a reason to complicate it. The master selection was the moment everyone in Corpse Blood Valley had been waiting for. The moment where the top graduates chose their masters, and the masters positioned themselves accordingly. 5 kings, 3 sect leaders, 4 valley heads. The full institutional weight of the Heaven and Earth Association arranged in a circle, watching 2 teenagers decide where they would spend the next phase of their lives. The boy stood in the center and said he would take bids. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Then several masters began speaking simultaneously, and the boy waited, and when the noise settled, he began negotiating the way he had been negotiating since the jail cell, with patience and specific knowledge of what each person in the room wanted and what they were willing to give for it. Then he said he was from an Orthodox family, from the Alliance. The room went still in a different way. An Orthodox candidate who had made top rank in the Heaven and Earth's own recruitment trial. The political implications ran in several directions at once, and each master in the room was calculating which direction pointed at them. Before anyone could decide what to do with the information, he declared he was cutting all ties with the Orthodox Alliance and joining the association of his own free will. The information that had been a weapon in his enemy's hands became, in the same breath, useless. Nobody who had been planning to use his origin against him had anywhere left to aim it. The bid continued. He chose the Dark Sect leader. Not because of the Dark Sect's power. Its leader was formidable, but not the strongest offer on the table. Because the Dark Sect had an intelligence network that reached into every corner of the association, and the Dark Sect leader had access to information that other sect leaders did not, and somewhere inside the association there was a thread that led to Ghostblade, and information was how you found threads. The Dark Sect leader accepted him with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had acquired something valuable. He was not wrong. He was wrong about which of them was acquiring the other. The Dark Sect occupied a compound within the association's main campus, a collection of low buildings arranged around a courtyard where the wind came from the wrong direction and the shadows fell slightly earlier than they should have. The boy arrived with one visible familiar spirit, one name plaque from the third disciple, and no martial arts reputation that anyone inside the compound could independently verify. Within a week, he owned it. Not formally, not in any way that could be recorded or reported. The rooftop assassin that the Dark Leader had placed to watch him, a quiet professional who worked through the night shift and believed he was invisible, was possessed by demonic monk on the third evening. After that, what the Dark Leader received as reports from his watcher was whatever the boy decided the Dark Leader should know. The watcher moved, breathed, ate, maintained his post, filed his observations with the right people at the right times. He was simply no longer making his own decisions. The escort assigned to accompany the boy through the compound met a subtler fate. The boy did not possess him. He simply learned, over 3 days of conversation, exactly which pieces of information the escort valued and which anxieties were already running underneath the surface, and then arranged for the right rumors to reach the right people at moments that confirmed those anxieties without ever being traceable to a source. Within 5 days, the escort was reporting what he believed to be true, which was a version of the boy's activities so comprehensively edited that it constituted fiction. The Dark Sect's martial arts library was open to disciples. He read it all in the first 4 days, not browsing but consuming, page by page in the systematic way he had learned everything since childhood. The techniques he could not use immediately he catalogued. The ones that intersected with the thoughts-shattering 8 techniques he cross-referenced. By the end of the week, he understood the Dark Sect's full operational capability better than most of its senior members, and he had identified 3 specific techniques that could be learned in sequence and combined in a way the original masters had apparently not considered. He did not tell anyone this. He practiced in his room at night, which the possessed watcher reported as the boy sleeping peacefully. The old shaman presented a different problem. He was the head of the Underworld Pavilion, the association's shaman organization, the institutional home of Master Zhao's authority, and the formal structure through which spirit work operated within the compound. He had been in his position long enough to be careful about it, the way people become careful when they have held something valuable for decades and developed strong opinions about who else should be allowed near it. He had watched the boy arrive, watched Master Zhao's satisfaction, and formed conclusions that he was not yet ready to share, but was already beginning to act on. He was dangerous in the specific way of someone who was right. He understood that the boy was not what he appeared. He could not yet prove it, but he was moving in the right direction, and given enough time and enough access, he would reach an answer that created problems. The boy did not give him enough time. Master Zhao had a technique called the 6-man necromancy, a ritual designed for coordinated spirit work, requiring multiple practitioners to anchor. He had taught it to his disciples as part of standard Underworld Pavilion training, which meant the boy had access to it, and more relevantly had access to the understanding of how its targeting system worked. The technique, applied correctly, could be redirected. Not in a way its creator had designed for, but in a way that the death energy made possible, a third path through the ritual's structure that the original inventor had not imagined because the original inventor was not working with death energy and had no reason to account for it. He waited for the right moment. The old shaman's schedule was predictable in the way of men who have done the same work for many years and find comfort in predictability. When the moment came, the boy used the 6-man necromancy technique, Master Zhao's own system, turned inward, redirected through the death energy to collapse the shaman's defenses from an angle they had not been built to face. The old shaman died. It was not loud. Master Zhao was in the next room. He came in at the sound of... There was no sound. He came in at the absence of sound, which was its own kind of signal to a man who had worked with spirits long enough to recognize when a room's energy had changed. He looked at the old shaman. He looked at the boy. He looked at the cursed oath beads in his own pocket, which he had believed gave him control of the situation, and understood very suddenly that the control he believed he had was the kind that exists only until someone decides to stop honoring it. The boy sat across from him, patient. He laid the cursed oath beads on the table between them. He explained the false name, calmly, not as a taunt, as information, provided without cruelty in the same register he used for everything. The oath bound the name, not the person. The person had never been bound. Zhao could report this to the Dark Leader, in which case both of them would need to account for what had happened to the old shaman, which was a conversation neither of them wanted to have. Or Zhao could pick up the beads and swear again, this time to the boy, this time with a name Zhao himself would choose, making the bond real in both directions. Zhao picked up the beads, he swore, and because the boy was thorough, he included in the terms of the oath a provision that Zhao would, over time, forget the boy's actual origins, a gentle erosion of the specific memories that could be used against him, implemented through the same cursed bead mechanism that Zhao had intended to use as a leash. The underworld pavilion had a new head. He was, functionally, the boy's. Go-chan's situation was separate and considerably more humiliating. The boy had arranged for him to enter the association compound undercover, an infiltration that used the entertainment networks that serviced the campus as its access route. It was a reasonable plan. Go-chan was adaptable, was former assassin enough to maintain a cover under moderate pressure, and had done more difficult things than pretend to be a visitor. The cover the plan required was a woman's identity. This was already uncomfortable. The body Go-chan occupied, the assassin Chiran's body, which he inhabited as a familiar spirit, was female, which he had not made peace with and was not going to make peace with, and the cover required him to lean into it rather than minimize it. He was introduced into the compound as a companion, the specific category of companion that certain powerful members maintained for their own comfort, which was a well-understood social category in this world, and one that came with access to areas that other visitors were not shown. The Axe King's disciple acquired him. This was not in the plan. The disciple was a large man with enthusiastic energy and an apparently genuine belief that the arrangement was mutually agreeable. Go-chan spent 3 days in a situation that could not be described as physical danger, but that he found, in many ways, harder to endure than physical danger. He reported this to the boy through their familiar bond with a specificity and emotional intensity that suggested he needed someone to understand the full scope of what was happening to him. The boy listened. He was not unsympathetic. He did acknowledge that the intelligence Go-chan was gathering from this position was genuinely useful, that the Axe King's disciple had opinions about internal association politics that he shared freely in moments of comfort, and that this made Go-chan's arrangement objectively valuable. Go-chan said several things in response. The boy told him the operation was going well, and they would wrap it up soon. Go-chan's familiar bond transmitted a quality that did not have a precise name, but occupied the territory between resignation and specifically directed resentment. Alaris, watching from her vessel in the boy's shadow, found this situation funnier than she was willing to admit. She had developed an opinion of Go-chan that was approximately fond, the kind of affection that comes from watching someone demonstrate loyalty in impractical circumstances over an extended period. She laughed when the boy summarized Go-chan's latest report, and then denied laughing, and the boy let her have the denial because arguing about it served neither of them. The blind man's problem arrived without warning. That was its nature. His name in the association's hierarchy was Second Peak, the most capable subordinate of the second disciple, who was the cruelest of the association leader's 3 students and who had been watching the boy since the treasury incident, with an attention that had nothing cooperative in it. The second disciple was not the first disciple's kind of dangerous. He was not powerful enough to be a direct physical threat at the level that mattered, but he was the kind of person who maintained assets specifically for situations where direct action was inadvisable. Second Peak was one of those assets. The blind man had found something. His method of detection did not rely on sight. He worked through sound, through the micro-variations in breathing that a person produces under different emotional states, through the specific quality of a calm heartbeat in a situation that should not produce calm. He had been listening to the boy in shared spaces, in the compound corridors, during the formation practice sessions that dark sect disciples attended, and what he heard when he listened to the boy was the wrong thing. Normal people, in situations that carry social risk, produce a heartbeat that reflects the risk. It speeds slightly. It varies. The variation is involuntary and extremely difficult to control. The boy's heartbeat did not do this. Not because he was trained. Trained fighters still produced micro-variations at the level the blind man was listening for. Because the boy was simply not experiencing the situations as risky. Because the boy looked at a room full of killers and calculated outcomes and found the outcomes acceptable, which his body registered as calm, which was a very different kind of calm than the practiced calm of a disciplined martial artist. The blind man brought this to the second disciple. The second disciple made arrangements. A woman came to the boy's quarters. Not a social visit, she was an assassin, carrying a specific mission, plant evidence that would connect the boy to orthodox spy activity inside the compound. Documents, coded in Alliance cipher, hidden in locations he would be blamed for. The framing was sophisticated enough that even an investigation by people who trusted him would have difficulty dismissing it cleanly. She did not account for Alaris. The blue indigo spirit had been watching the boy's quarters with the particular attentiveness of someone who has decided, without formally admitting it, that his continued survival has become important to her. She felt the woman's approach before the woman reached the door. She felt the intent behind it, not from reading minds but from reading the specific quality of someone moving carefully in a building they are not supposed to be in, the quality of someone carrying something they need to hide. She told the boy. He was already awake. What followed was not a fight in the traditional sense. The assassin never made it past the threshold in the way she had intended. Alaris handled the physical confrontation, the indigo spirit filling the space between the door and the room with her presence, which at her current level was not an abstraction, but a thing with weight and temperature. The assassin found her body no longer receiving the commands she was sending it. Not in the way of paralysis, but in the way of a river suddenly asked to run uphill. The energy was there, the instruction was there, the body simply went somewhere else first. Alaris was precise about what she wanted. She needed the woman to be useful before she ceased being a problem. Under the blue indigo presence, the assassin's body moved to the compound's common space during the morning shift change, and in front of the three people whose testimony would matter most in any subsequent accounting, she confessed. Clearly. In her own voice, with her own face, with the specific factual detail that only comes from someone who was actually present for the planning. The blind man had set the frame, the second disciple had ordered it, and the documents she was carrying had been prepared in the second disciple's own private archive. The people who heard the confession included the Dark Leader's senior aide, one of the Demon Mask's valley subordinates, and a pavilion shaman who owed Master Zhao a significant professional debt. The three of them went in different directions immediately. The information traveled accordingly. By the afternoon, the second disciple had a problem that required his complete attention, and the boy was not on his list of immediate concerns. The blind man came himself that night, not through the second disciple's order, through his own anger, which had the quality of something personal. He had been listening to the boy for weeks. He understood, with a precision that most people never reached, that the boy was not what he appeared. He came with the intention of being the person who removed the problem before it became larger, and he came prepared for a martial artist. He was not prepared for the death energy. The ritual of expulsion, the second technique of the thought-shattering 8, worked in the direction opposite the ritual of attachment. Where attachment pulled and drew inward, expulsion pushed outward with a force calibrated by the quality of energy behind it. The boy had been cultivating death energy at the apex ascendant level since the cliff pit, and the metamorphosis he had undergone during the treasury session had begun converting some of that foundation into the darker energy. The third type, still unnamed, still unrecognized by anyone who had encountered it. He pushed. The blind man, who had never encountered anything that moved the way this moved, had no defensive framework that addressed it. He was a superb conventional fighter with an extraordinary sensory gift. He was fighting something that did not work the way conventional fighting had taught him things worked. He died. The boy stood over him for a moment, not with satisfaction exactly, more with the specific attention of someone noting what had happened for future reference. Then he used the 6-person summoning technique. The death energy in the room was fresh, and the blind man's consciousness had not fully dispersed, and with the right application of the technique, a grudge spirit could be anchored before it scattered. The blind man opened his eyes. His first sight as a spirit was the boy's face, attentive, almost kind, explaining the new arrangement. He had 4 familiar spirits now. 5, counting the demonic monk, who had been with him the longest, and maintained a running opinion on every development, with the smug authority of someone who felt his early investment had been validated. The Dark Sector compound was, in practical terms, his. He had been in it for 7 days. The Poison King found him in the second week, one of the 5 kings. 8-star level, evolutionary realm, a man who had built a reputation in the association, not through politics, but through the simple and sustained fact that very few people had ever successfully moved against him. He had a reason to want to speak with the boy that had nothing to do with the trials or the master selection. He had fought Ghostblade once, years ago, and survived. which made him the only person the boy had found so far who could speak to Ghostblade's technique from direct experience. He was also dying. Not quickly. The wound Ghostblade had left in him was slow, the kind of damage that works through a person over years, degrading the body's ability to process its own energy at a rate that most healers had examined and declined to address, because addressing it would require access to the affected pathways at a depth that most healers did not have. The boy had access to those pathways, not through healing arts, through death energy, which moved through the body's channels in a direction that life energy techniques could not reach, which meant it could touch the wound from the inside in a way that nothing else in the conventional martial world was equipped to do. He had never applied his energy this way. He considered it for approximately the time it took him to calculate that a Poison King who was grateful was an asset of a specific kind, that an asset of that kind was relevant to finding Ghostblade, and that the calculation therefore resolved clearly. He worked for 3 hours. The death energy moved through channels in the Poison King's body that had been compromised for years, finding the wound's edge and doing what death energy does at depth, not healing in the conventional sense, but resetting the balance between what was there and what was missing, clearing the degradation the way you clear a blocked passage by working from the far side. The Poison King's body recognized, somewhere in the middle of the second hour, that something had changed. His own energy stopped fighting the process, not because he had relaxed, but because the process no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like something returning to where it was supposed to be. At the end of the third hour, his internal energy underwent the shift that happens when a body that has been constrained for years suddenly has the capacity it was always reaching for. He broke through to the evolutionary realm proper. Not the threshold he had been sitting at, not the approach. The actual evolutionary realm, the domain of the 6 heavens and the very top of what this world could produce, achieved in a single afternoon in a room with a boy who was watching with professional interest. The Poison King was quiet for a long time afterward. Then he told the boy everything he knew about Ghostblade, the technique, the movement signature, the specific quality of the strikes, the way they were placed not for maximum damage but for maximum precision, which was a philosophical position as much as a technical one, the philosophy of a swordsman who believed that efficiency was its own kind of artistry. The same philosophy that had cut the Manor Lord's body in that distinctive way, that had cut the boy's grandfather in half in the mountains while he was away gathering herbs. He had a much clearer picture now. The Poison King said, after, that he would like to consider the boy family. This was not a political statement. Or not only a political statement. He said it the way people say things they have been holding for longer than the immediate conversation. And he meant it in both the senses available to it. Genuine affection and genuine alliance. Neither one diminishing the other. The boy accepted. He was not effusive about it. He said something brief that was adequate, and the Poison King seemed to find it sufficient, and that was how the arrangement was settled. What came next was not something either of them had scheduled. The first disciple was waiting outside the dark sect compound when the boy walked out 3 days later. There was no warning, no formal challenge. The first disciple operated from a position of authority that did not require the politeness of advance notice. He was the association leader's most powerful student, evolutionary realm, and he had a silver eye that had been looking at the boy since the treasury incident with an increasing unease that had now resolved into a decision. He had looked at the boy and seen something he did not have a word for. Something that the silver eye, which had never encountered an image it could not name, could not name. Something that was not danger in the way he understood danger. Not the danger of a strong fighter or a clever schemer, but a different category entirely. The kind of danger that exists when the rules that govern what is possible have stopped applying. He attacked because he was the kind of person who resolves uncertainty by eliminating its source. The boy had approximately 3 seconds of warning from Alaris, who felt the first disciple's energy signature approach from the south side of the compound. 3 seconds was, in the gap between evolutionary realm power and apex ascendant realm defense, not enough time to do anything useful except not be where the first strike landed. He moved. The strike took a piece of the wall behind him. The difference in their levels was not something he could close by technique or strategy in the first exchange. The first disciple was evolutionary realm, the domain above transcendent, above transformation, a level of power that made the gap between first-rate and ascendant look modest. He was moving at a speed that the boy's physical body could track but not answer, hitting with a force that the boy's death energy core could absorb partially but not fully. He was losing. He knew he was losing within the first 10 seconds, and that knowledge sat in him without panic, which he found faintly interesting even in the middle of it. Alaris came out of him. She did not ask permission. She moved from her position as a bound spirit into full manifestation, the indigo level released without constraint, the blood world opening in the space around both of them, flooding the area between the boy and the first disciple with her energy. She bought time. Not much. The first disciple was strong enough to press through even indigo-level spirit opposition, but not immediately, not without redirecting his attention, which gave the boy 30 seconds he would not otherwise have had. He used them. He thought about the Poison King's breakthrough. He had watched it from 3 feet away, the specific sequence of changes in the energy channels that preceded the shift, the moment where the body's resistance to its own potential collapsed inward, and what waited on the other side of that collapse became accessible. He had memorized it the same way he memorized everything, and now, with Alaris burning herself down to buy him half a minute, he did the thing that no one in the martial world had ever done on purpose. He forced it, not a gradual cultivation reaching its natural conclusion, not the decades of preparation that a king-level fighter needed to approach that threshold. A deliberate collapse of his own energy architecture, a controlled destruction of the wall between what he was and what the death energy in his core was reaching toward, executed in real time while a first disciple-level fighter was 10 feet away, working through an indigo spirit barrier. It took 23 of the 30 seconds. What came out of the collapse was not death energy. The third type, the black energy without a name, the thing that had no precedent and no category in the martial world's 3,000-year taxonomy of power, expanded outward from his core, in a single pulse that the first disciple felt through the barrier before it physically reached him. The first disciple stopped. For the first time in a fight that the boy had been losing comprehensively, the first disciple paused and re-evaluated. The Silver Eye saw it. Whatever the Silver Eye saw, it was enough to change the first disciple's expression from controlled aggression to something adjacent to what he had felt in the treasury. That atavistic signal, the body knowing before the mind, the ancient instinct that recognizes the thing it was not designed to face. The fight that followed was not the same fight that had started it. Before the metamorphosis, the boy had been managing, finding angles, spending Alaris's coverage carefully, staying mobile in the specific way of someone who cannot absorb a direct hit and is spending every second making sure one does not land. Reactive, tactical, surviving on calculation while the clock ran down to something he had not yet identified but was moving toward. After, he was something else. The demonic energy did not announce itself the way power usually announces itself in this world, not a flare, not a visible aura, not the kind of display that makes bystanders step back and reach for descriptive language. It was quiet. It moved through his channels the way deep water moves, with a weight that did not need to be loud about itself because weight does not require volume. The first disciple felt it against his own evolutionary realm energy, and the feeling was not being outmatched. It was being made uncertain, which is different, and in some ways harder. The Silver Eye was still reading him. Whatever it was seeing, it had not fully processed, and the first disciple was too disciplined to let an open question stop him. He pressed forward, driving through the last of Alaris's barrier with the intent of finishing before the new energy had time to stabilize. The boy used the Beck family poison arts. He had read the Beck manual in a single glance, months ago in the Manor's underground passage, and filed every technique in the photographic archive that served as his memory. The Beck family poison arts were not a conventional fighting system. They were designed for someone with a poison body, built around the specific advantage of being toxic in ways that standard defenses did not account for. The techniques assumed that physical contact was not a disadvantage but a weapon. Every exchange where skin met skin, every grip, every blocked strike, was an opportunity for the poison in the blood to migrate. He let the first disciple hit him, took the strike on the forearm instead of avoiding it, a deliberate sacrifice, the kind that requires knowing precisely how much damage you can absorb and trusting the calculation while the impact is happening. The first disciple's hand made contact. The demonic energy spiked outward through the point of contact, carrying the poison in the blood along a channel that the Beck techniques described and the first disciple's defenses had not been configured to close. The Silver Eye dilated. The first disciple felt something moving through him that his internal energy could not address because it was not coming from outside. It had been introduced at the boundary, the place where outside became inside, and it was already past the defenses by the time the defenses knew it was there. He pulled back. The first disciple pulled back, which was something nobody watching had ever seen him do, and the space between them opened, and the boy stood in that space and let the demonic energy settle around him like weather. The Poison King arrived. He had been watching from the compound's eastern wall since the fight began, not hiding, not approaching, reading the situation with the assessment of someone who had been at this level for decades and knew precisely what each phase of a high-level engagement looked like from the outside. He had watched Alaris burn down her reserves. He had watched the metamorphosis, which he recognized because he had just undergone something adjacent to it 3 days earlier, and he had understood in the moment it happened what it meant and what it did not yet mean. That the boy had the power, but not the seasoning. That demonic energy at first emergence was formidable, but unsteady, and that the first disciple, even compromised, was not going to simply stop. He came down from the wall, not at full speed, deliberately, at a pace that communicated his intentions clearly to everyone watching before his energy was close enough to be misread as aggression. He placed himself between the first disciple and the boy, which was a statement that required no accompanying words because the Poison King, making a physical statement of that kind, was already a complete sentence in the language of this world's power structure. The first disciple looked at him, looked at the boy behind him, looked at the silver eyes reading of the boy, which had not finished processing, but had processed enough to make conclusions uncomfortable. He did not leave. Not immediately. The first disciple was not a man who left situations, he resolved them. But he was also not a man who spent himself against an unfavorable configuration purely for the sake of completion, and the configuration had changed. The poison was working through his system. The demonic energy was an unknown. The Poison King at his back was a known, and the known was sufficient on its own. He stood. He breathed. His expression went through something that was not quite calculation and not quite recognition, something that sits between them, the place where a mind very close to the truth has not yet arrived but can feel the shape of it. Then the Poison King moved, not at the first disciple's core, at his face. Specifically at the silver eye, which had been the instrument of the first disciple's reading throughout the fight, which had seen things it was not supposed to see, and would carry that information back to the association leader, along with a report that the boy could not afford to have delivered in full. The Poison King's hand moved with the speed of someone operating at evolutionary realm without any of the restraint that courtesy requires, and the silver eye left the first disciple's face. The sound the first disciple made was the first sound he had made during the entire engagement. He did not collapse. Men who have been at his level for long enough do not collapse from pain the way ordinary people do. The body has been rebuilt by years of cultivation into something that processes damage as information rather than crisis. He staggered. He caught himself. He looked at the Poison King with the one eye he had left, and what passed between them was the kind of acknowledgement that serious fighters extend to each other when both parties have been entirely clear about where they stand. The boy said, clearly enough to be heard, that he was not going to kill him. He said it without apology and without sentiment, as a logistical statement, the kind that contains its own explanation. The association leader would retaliate, the timing was wrong, there was a sequence to these things and the sequence required patience. He said it the way a man says the road is closed, not a preference, a fact. The first disciple was unconscious before he finished the sentence. The poison had reached a threshold that his energy could not hold back anymore, and when that threshold crossed, the body's priority shifted from continuing the fight to continuing to exist. He went down with the specific controlled quality of someone who has lost consciousness before and knows, somewhere below awareness, how to do it without additional damage. The Poison King looked at the silver eye in his hand, put it in his pocket, made a noise that was not quite a laugh and not quite satisfaction, but sat comfortably between them. The boy's legs stopped working. Not dramatically, he sat down. The metamorphosis had cost him in proportion to what it had produced, and the demonic energy that was now the primary system in his body was new enough that the channels it moved through were raw, the way new growth is tender before it hardens. He sat on the ground of the compound courtyard with his back against the wall and his hands on his knees, and looked at nothing in particular, while his body communicated its opinions about what he had asked it to do. Alaris came back to him. She was thin. The coverage she had held for those 30 seconds had drawn from her reserves past what was comfortable and into what was risky, and she was quieter than usual, which was the form her exhaustion took. She did not tell him it had been reckless. She sat inside the familiar bond and said nothing, which meant she had said everything she needed to say about it. He told her she had done well. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said something brief and deflecting that was the closest she was able to get, in that register, to thanking him for noticing. He had not understood, until that moment, how completely he had come to rely on her presence, not as a resource, as a constant. The way you come to rely on something that has been there long enough that you stop consciously noting it and only notice it in the moment it almost isn't there. He said nothing. She would not have wanted him to. The Poison King sat beside him on the ground, which was not a thing a 5 Kings level fighter normally did, and they stayed there in the cooling afternoon while the compound around them registered what had happened and chose, collectively, to process it somewhere else. But this is not where the story's real weight lives. This is not the moment that broke the boy's surface, not the metamorphosis, not the fight, not the first disciple crumpling. Those were victories, and victories had never been what fractured him. Gochan's death was different. And to understand it properly, you have to go back to Mocksword Manor, to the weeks before the association arrived, when the Flying Assassin sect came to finish what Guardcam had started. Her name was Sharon, Chiron, the granddaughter of the sect's founder, the new leader, 20 years old and carrying a weapon that had been passed down through the sect's leadership like a covenant, the keen benevolence needle. A single needle, slender as a hair, capable of passing through internal energy defenses because it moved at an angle that conventional martial arts technique did not cover. She was not the strongest fighter the boy had faced. She was the most precisely dangerous. She took Gochan. Not in a fight, in the margin between moments, in the space where preparation ends and reaction begins. Gochan was outside. She was faster. She had him before he understood she was there, and she used him the way a professional uses leverage, not to hurt, but to redirect. A hostage is not a target. A hostage is a pressure point. The boy appeared at the courtyard gate. He had been inside, and now he was outside, and the space between those two facts was not explained. He looked at Gochan, at the needle near Gochan's throat, at Chiron's expression, at the geometry of the situation, and he knelt. This surprised everyone present, including Alaris. He knelt slowly, one knee at a time, with the deliberateness of someone who has made a calculation and is executing it. His hands were visible. His face was calm. He looked like a person who had decided that Gochan's life was worth more than his pride, and that the mathematics of the situation resolved clearly in favor of compliance. What he was actually doing was giving Alaris an angle. He had positioned himself between Chiron's line of sight and the approach from the east, which created a shadow, not literally, but informationally, a blind spot produced by the geometry of where bodies were in relation to each other. Alaris moved through that shadow in the half-second that Chiron spent reading the boy's compliance as genuine. The indigo spirit gathered herself for a strike that would end the situation before the needle moved. Chiron felt it. Her instincts were good enough. The needle left her hand, not at the boy, at Gochan, because a professional who feels the situation slipping does not give the hostage back. The hostage is the only remaining asset, and the only way to use it is to use it. Gochan stepped in front of it. This was not a calculation. There was no time for calculation. It was the thing underneath calculation, the thing that operates when thinking has not caught up yet, and what moves is whatever you actually are beneath the layers of training and self-presentation. What Gochan actually was, beneath the former assassin and the possessed body, and the embarrassed dignity, and the months of service to a boy who had never thanked him for anything, was someone who had decided a long time ago that this was the person he was not going to let die. The needle caught him in the side, small. You could cover the entry wound with a fingertip. The keen benevolence needle was not designed to kill quickly, it was designed to kill completely, to move through the body at a pace that allowed the target to understand what was happening, to reach organs in sequence rather than simultaneously. The sect's founder had believed there was something meaningful in that. The philosophy had been passed down along with the weapon. Gochan did not fall immediately. He stood for a moment with his hand pressed to his side, and his expression doing something that was mostly trying to reassure the boy that it was fine, which was the kind of expression that makes the thing worse rather than better. The boy crossed the courtyard. Chiran was already beyond him. Alaris had taken her into the blood world in the way that left no trace and no body, and no evidence that anything had happened except that a person had been present and then was not. The boy was not thinking about Chiran. He was thinking about nothing. He moved to Gochan the way a body moves toward the thing it has decided to protect after it has already failed to protect it, which is a movement with no good options at its destination and no way to stop making it. Gochan sat down in the courtyard. The boy sat with him. There was a conversation. The source does not record it word for word, and narrating it in full detail would be the wrong approach, because the weight of it is not in the words. It is in the quality of what Gochan was saying and the quality of what the boy was not saying. Gochan said he was not frightened. He said this with the specific conviction of someone who has checked and found it to be true and is surprised and grateful to find it true. He said the boy was the only person who had never left him behind. He said this as a fact, not as a complaint about anyone else. He was not listing grievances. He had been used most of his life, set aside when convenient, picked up when useful, discarded when the calculation changed. The ordinary experience of a man in his position in this world. He had made a separate calculation, somewhere in the weeks of watching and selective reporting and choosing loyalty over the job he had been assigned to do, and the calculation had resolved as, this is the person, this is the place, this is the commitment I will not revise even when it costs me. It was costing him now. He noted this without particular drama. The boy's surface held for most of it. He was listening, which was what Gochan needed, and he was present, which was the thing he was best at providing, because presence did not require the emotional vocabulary that everything else required. He was there. His hand was on Gochan's arm. His face was doing something that the source describes as breaking, in the specific sense of a material that has been under sustained pressure finally reaching the stress point where the structure can no longer hold its shape. He did not weep. That is not what breaking looks like in a person built the way he was built. What happened was quieter and harder to name, a quality in his stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. The way a room's silence is different at 3 in the morning than it is at noon, even though the absence of sound is the same. Gochan died happy. That is the part that sits heaviest. Not the death itself. Death is common enough in this story and in this world that it has no special claim on weight. The happiness is what gives it weight, because he meant it, because he had measured the life he had led and found this ending better than he had any right to expect, and because the person holding his arm while it happened was the reason the ending was what it was. The boy sat with him for a while after. Then he stood up. He was steady. He did whatever he did to the part of himself that had broken, which was not repair and was not suppression, but was something more like acknowledgement, noting the break, noting what it meant, filing it in the place where the things that matter live, and continuing. Because continuing was what you did. It had always been what you did. He used the 6-person spirit summoning technique. He had used it once before, in theory, and the theory held. Fresh death energy, a consciousness not yet dispersed, the right structure applied at the right moment. The familiar bond caught Gochan's spirit before it scattered. The problem was the vessel. No suitable male body was available. The only body present in the specific sense of already being there, already prepared, already a vessel with established spirit residency capacity because Alaris had used it, was Kiran's. The assassin's body. Female. He asked Gochan inside the bond how he felt about that. Gochan said several things. They were specific and deeply felt and constituted a complete philosophical position on the subject of bodily dignity and masculine identity. The boy listened to all of them. Then he explained that the alternative was dissolution, and that he preferred Gochan to continue existing even in a form that Gochan found objectionable, because Gochan was useful and Gochan was his, and both of those things remained true regardless of which body was involved. Gochan was placed in Chiran's body. He opened his eyes, looked down at himself, and was quiet for a moment that had a very specific texture to it. The quiet of a man discovering something he cannot change and has not finished deciding how to feel about. Then he said something terse. The boy told him to clean up the courtyard. Gochan looked at the mess, at his own former body among other things, and said at length that he was a man. The boy agreed that he was. He told him to clean up the courtyard anyway. Alaris watched this from Chiran's body, which she had also been using as a vessel, and vacated it for Gochan with the specific graciousness of someone who does not want to be caught being gracious. She had been using a maid's body for most of her in-manner activities, which she found adequate for the purpose of eating, an activity she had been denied for a century and had strong feelings about, and she transitioned back to it without comment. The demonic monk's opinion of all this was voluble and satisfied, because he had been the senior familiar spirit since the beginning and found Gochan's situation validating in ways he did not bother to obscure. Gochan said, eventually, days later, when the initial shock had settled into something more like chronic indignation, that he was still himself. That being in this body did not change what he had decided in the courtyard, what he had decided over the months before the courtyard, what he had decided about who he was going to be loyal to even when the options were bad. He was not graceful about any of it. He was embarrassed every morning and he complained regularly, and he had very specific opinions about the indignities of his situation that he shared with anyone who would listen, which was primarily the demonic monk, who listened with visible enjoyment. But he stayed. He was always going to stay. That is what the demonic monk's enjoyment was actually about, if you looked at it from the right angle. Not mockery, but the recognition of a quality it respected. The demonic monk had been a grudge spirit, bound by fury, carrying something unfinished for as long as grudge spirits carry things. It knew what it looked like when someone had made a decision that could not be unmade, when commitment had gone all the way down to a level below revision. Gochan had made that decision. He wore it in the wrong body, with ongoing objections, with the regular humiliation of being recognized by people who had known Chiran and making rapid adjustments. He wore it without dissolving. The boy watched him and said nothing about what he saw. He had learned, sometime in the weeks at the manor, that Gochan did not need his observations. Gochan needed to be used well and treated as someone worth accounting for, and those were things the boy could provide without announcements. He provided them, consistently, not with warmth in any conventional sense. He was not built for warmth in the conventional sense, but with the specific recognition that means you are seen by the person you most want to be seen by, and that recognition is its own kind of warmth if you are standing close enough to feel it. The manor lord woke on a morning that had no particular weather, gray, still, the kind of day that does not announce itself. He had been unconscious since the night the boy cut off his arms, which was a thing the outer hall master's official account described in terms that made it sound like a medical intervention rather than what it was. The manor had reorganized around his absence the way households reorganize around a missing structural element, carefully, with a great deal of political repositioning disguised as ordinary activity. All 4 young masters were summoned. The boy sat among them with the patience of someone who has been in this exact kind of room before, the kind where everyone is performing a version of themselves slightly more composed than the one they actually inhabit. The first son was drunk at the morning hour and working to hide it imperfectly. The second son had an expression of careful sympathy that did not reach his eyes. Yu-chan sat straight and looked at the manor lord with the unguarded attention of someone who genuinely loved his father and was relieved to see him alive. The boy was looking at the manor lord's body, specifically at the area beneath the robe's collar, where the manor lord had shifted his weight and the fabric had moved, and a portion of his chest was briefly visible, and there was a wound there, old, dried, but distinctive in the way that distinctive things remain distinctive regardless of age. A single lateral cut, the angle, the depth, the precision. The same wound the boy had found on the dried body in the underground chamber. The same wound he had found on his grandfather, in the farmhouse, in the ashes. He adjusted nothing in his expression. He continued sitting. He filed the confirmation with everything else he had filed, and the low constant temperature at which he had been running since the word damn ticked upward by exactly enough to register and no more. Ghostblade had been to this manor. Ghostblade had business with the manor lord that left the same mark it had left on an old herbalist living alone in the mountains. The thread from his grandfather's death passed through this room, through this man, and continued somewhere beyond both of them, toward the association, toward the leader who knew Ghostblade's identity, toward a destination the boy was now considerably better positioned to reach than he had been 4 months ago. He thanked no one for this information. No one knew they had given it. The Heaven and Earth Association's arrival 2 days later was not subtle. Sun Yun came first, with the formal authority of someone making an institutional demand. The Bright Blade King came behind him, carrying the specific gravity of a man who has spent decades making ceilings feel lower. The Underworld Pavilion Shaman came last, which was appropriate. Shamans operate at the margins of scenes, reading what the center of the room misses. They wanted the human skin book. They stated this clearly, with the specific directness of people who do not usually need to ask twice. The Manor Lord, still adjusting to consciousness, still adjusting to the reality of his arms, still surrounded by sons whose loyalty he was not yet fully certain of, produced the location with the compliance of someone who has calculated that resistance would be costly and the treasure was not his anyway. They opened the box, empty. The boy was standing to the left of the main group. He had positioned himself there when they arrived, which put him adjacent to the First Lady's position and gave him a natural line of sight to the box's interior that would not be read as particular interest. He watched Sun Yun's face when the box opened, and he watched the Bright Blade King's stillness, which was more informative than Sun Yun's expression, because stillness at that level is a controlled response to something that warranted a different response. His hand moved to his outer robe pocket. The First Lady's earrings had been there for weeks, carried with the patience of someone who does not act until the action will be decisive. He was not hasty about it. He let the chaos of the empty box develop, the Manor Lord's confusion, the First Lady's rapid political calculation, the second son's careful positioning at the edge of the scene, and in the moment when every eye in the room was moving between the box and the Manor Lord, he placed the earrings. The First Lady's face changed when she saw them, changed again when she saw the association officials looking at them, changed a third time when she understood that the sequence of expressions she had just produced in the presence of 5 witnesses was itself evidence of something, regardless of what she said next. She said several things next. They were composed and specific and addressed the right people in the right order. They did not help. The Underworld Pavilion Shaman had stopped looking at the earrings. He was looking at the boy. Specifically at the boy's eyes, which were doing what the boy's eyes always did when his ghost sight was active. A quality of focus that did not belong to normal vision. A depth of attention that was reading something the shaman recognized as spirit layer information. Born sight, extremely rare. The kind of gift a shaman organization paid considerable resources to acquire. He wanted the boy as a disciple. He said so with the directness of someone who has assessed the value of what he is looking at and is not interested in indirect approaches. The boy demonstrated memory of the book. He recited the Moon Vein Sword scripture in the formal notation, with the movement sequences that Alaris had taught him in the hours after she had agreed, reluctantly, to teach him anything at all. She was careful during the recitation. She kept her own energy signature contained, presenting as a contracted spirit rather than what she actually was, and she was so practiced at concealment that Sun Yun's immediate recognition of the scripture did not extend to recognition of the source behind the boy's technique. Sun Yun's composure, which was considerable, did not survive the first 2 verses intact. His expression went through the specific progression of a man encountering something he had believed was permanently lost. Not joy, exactly, but the unsettling quality of a door, opening in a wall you had stopped believing contained doors. The boy stopped mid-verse. He pressed the edge of his own blade to his throat. He said, with complete serenity, that the knowledge lived in him rather than in an object, and that recovering it from a corpse was a problem he would be happy to leave them with if they pushed him. Sun Yun stopped him. Of course he stopped him. The negotiation that followed had a structure the boy had prepared for over the weeks since he first read the Manor Lord's wound and understood where the thread led. He was not improvising. He had the destination, the association, access, institutional cover, a position close enough to the leader that the leader's knowledge of Ghostblade's identity became something he could eventually reach, and he was building toward it with each exchange, giving things that cost him little in exchange for the arrangement he needed. He offered to come voluntarily. He framed it as a hostage arrangement, which was familiar enough in the martial world's political vocabulary that it required no special justification. The association received an asset. The manor received the association's formal interest, which was its own kind of protection. Everyone left the table with something. In the carriage, heading toward Corpse Blood Valley, he was quiet for the first part of the journey. Yuchan sat across from him with the specific expression of someone who has been through enough by now to be past surprise, but not past observation. The mock brother was going as a genuine prize. His talent was real, his ranking was real, and the Bright Blade King had a specific kind of interest in prodigies that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the need certain master-level fighters have to see what a genuinely talented student becomes. He is worth noting here, the mock brother, because his trajectory from this point runs parallel to the boy's in a way that the story has been building toward without announcing it. He was everything the boy was not: trained, morally legible, driven by a framework of justice that the boy had no use for and occasionally found mildly entertaining. He had practiced the corrupted martial art with genuine commitment. He had developed the blood reversal technique in the crucible of a real fight, out of necessity, out of the specific desperation of a gifted fighter who has been pushed past the range of his preparation. He did not know, sitting in the carriage, that the technique he had developed was the result of sabotage. He would find out. The finding out would be its own kind of reckoning, not with the boy as an enemy, because the boy was not his enemy, but with the understanding of what kind of person he had been dealing with since the day a stranger walked into Mock Sword Manor wearing his family member's name and started rearranging everything. The boy, for his part, was thinking about the Poison King. He was thinking about the evolutionary realm, what the breakthrough had looked like from outside, what the channels had done in the moment before the shift, how the body's architecture had reorganized itself to accommodate a new ceiling. He was doing what he always did with information, holding it in the photographic archive, turning it over, looking for the application that the original holder had not considered. He did not know yet when he would need it. He filed it anyway. What happened next? The trials, the treasury, the dark sect, the blind man, the old shaman, the week of systematic possession and manipulation that turned the dark sect compound into something he owned without a title? All of that has been told. It brought him to the moment where the first disciple lay on the ground and the Poison King was beside him, and the afternoon air in the compound had the specific quality of something that has reached its conclusion. He sat against the wall for a long time. The dark sect leader came out eventually. He had been inside throughout the fight, which was either wisdom or cowardice. And the distinction did not matter much, because the outcome was the same. He looked at the first disciple on the ground. He looked at the boy against the wall. He looked at the Poison King, who was examining the silver eye in his palm with the attentiveness of someone deciding what to do with an unusual object, and he made a series of rapid calculations that resolved in the direction of saying very little. The Dark Leader asked if the boy required anything. The boy said water. The Dark Leader brought water, personally, which was not a thing he would have done for anyone else in the compound, and which communicated something about the revised topology of his understanding. The boy drank the water. He thought about what came next. The association leader was the next problem. The only person who knew Ghostblade's identity with certainty, the leader of the Heaven and Earth Association, one of the 6 heavens, the top of the power structure the boy had been infiltrating since the carriage ride from Mock Sword Manor. The leader was ill, which was a detail the boy had filed alongside everything else without yet knowing what it meant. Illness at that level of cultivation was not ordinary illness. It was either the result of cultivation errors, which was unlikely for someone who had reached the 6 heavens, or the result of external interference, which was more interesting and more useful. He had access now that he had not had before. The Dark Sect leader's intelligence network was his, practically speaking. Master Zhao's underworld pavilion was his. The Demon Mask, in Corpse Blood Valley, with his century-long loyalty to Alaris's legacy, was his institutional contact. The Poison King was beside him. The thread to Ghostblade was shorter than it had ever been. Alaris came fully into her vessel, the compact presence of an indigo spirit settling into the space she had claimed as her habitual form, and sat beside him against the wall. She did not say anything immediately. She had the quality of someone who has chosen her company and is not apologizing for it. He looked at her profile in the afternoon light. The resemblance to the third disciple was something he had not mentioned since the treasury, which was a form of restraint he was not generally known for. Alaris had not mentioned it either, which meant she had noticed his noticing and had opinions about it that she was not ready to have a conversation about. He did not push. They had an agreement. He would not dig into her past before she was ready, and she would tell him when she was ready. And neither of them had specified a timeline because neither of them was built for the kind of trust that operates on schedules. But the Moonvein sword scripture had been hers. The underworld pavilion, before it became what it was now, had been connected to something she had been part of. The century she had spent in the human skin book was not an accident. Someone had put her there, had wanted her contained and inaccessible, and the reason for that was connected to a history the boy was going to need to understand eventually, because Ghostblade was connected to the association leader, and the association leader's history went back far enough to intersect with whatever had happened to Olaris. She had said, once, that she wanted to die without regrets. She had said it in the moment before she came out of him to cover his retreat against the first disciple. Said it in the way people say the thing they have been holding when they are not certain there will be another opportunity. It was not a speech. It was small and precise, and she had not repeated it. He had heard it. He was going to make sure she did not need to. The Poison King stood. He had been sitting against the wall on the other side of the boy, and he rose with the deliberateness of a large man who has been still long enough that the movement requires intention. He walked to the first disciple. He looked down at him. Then, with the specific, considered quality of a man who has made a decision and is executing it without theater, he pressed one foot onto the first disciple's ankle and added a measured amount of pressure. The sound was quiet. The Poison King's expression was that of someone attending to unfinished business. He looked up at the boy with an expression of mild satisfaction. The boy looked back at him with an expression of mild acknowledgement. Neither of them offered comment. The first disciple, still unconscious, was going to wake up to a situation that had more components than he had gone to sleep with, and whatever plans he was forming in the dark of his own injured mind were going to have to account for an ankle and an eye socket, and the fact that the boy he had ambushed was now at a level of power that the Silver Eye had seen and not been able to categorize. The association leader would hear about this. The first disciple's report, when it came, would be the most unusual report the leader had received in a long time. A junior member of the Dark Sect who had forced an evolutionary realm breakthrough during a losing fight, who carried a third type of energy that the martial world's entire taxonomy did not contain, who had defeated the first disciple and then declined to finish it. The leader would want to see him. That was the plan. That had always been the plan, in the way that the boy's plans had always been. Not a sequence of steps toward a fixed destination, but a sequence of positions, each one opening a set of options that the previous position had not, each one moving the thread from his grandfather's body to the person who had ordered the cut. He stood, his legs held. The demonic energy had settled enough that the channels were no longer raw. They were new, which was different. New things could be worked with. New things had potential that raw things did not. Gochan appeared at the compound gate. He had been away. The intelligence gathering operation, the Axe King's disciple, the series of indignities that the boy had been hearing about through the familiar bond in ongoing installments. He was in Chiran's body, wearing clothes that were slightly wrong for the body's proportions because he was still making adjustments that he refused to ask for help with. He looked at the courtyard. He looked at the first disciple on the ground. He looked at the Poison King. He said, in a tone of someone who had been away and returned to find the situation had escalated in ways that were consistent with his expectations, that he had information about the association's internal communication patterns, specifically the channels the first disciple used to report to the leader, and that if the boy wanted to know what was going to be said before it was said, the information was available. The boy said that was good. He asked Gochan how the operation had gone. Gochan began to describe it. He spoke for a while. The description was detailed and specific, and contained within it the complete emotional record of the preceding weeks, in a form that was simultaneously a report and a complaint, and an accounting of costs. He delivered it with the specific dignity of someone who has decided they are going to tell this story once and completely, and then file it under completed. The boy listened. He did not interrupt. When Gochan was finished, he said that the information was useful, and the operation had been well executed. Gochan looked at him, said nothing for a moment. Then said that he was a man, which was by now a statement that had accrued enough shared context between them that it functioned as more than its literal content. The boy said he knew. Alaris made a sound that was not a laugh, and was not a laugh. Demonic Monk said something smug from his vessel that nobody dignified with a direct response. The courtyard was quiet in the late afternoon. The compound around them continued its functions. The dark sect's routines, the pavilion's schedules, the institutional machinery of the Heaven and Earth Association processing the events of the last hour through its various channels toward the people whose job it was to process such things. Somewhere in the compound's upper tier, the Dark Leader was writing a report whose language he was choosing with extreme care. Somewhere in the association's broader campus, the second disciple was dealing with the consequences of the blind man's failure and his own exposed machination, and the revised understanding of what the new dark sect disciple represented as a problem. And somewhere past all of that, in the inner sanctum of the association leader, the man who carried in his private knowledge the identity of a swordsman called Ghostblade, the man who knew why an old herbalist in the mountains had been cut in two and left for a 16-year-old boy to find, the first signals of an unusual situation were beginning to arrive. The boy looked at the compound gate, at the road beyond it, at the sequence of steps between where he was and where he needed to be. He was evolutionary realm. He had spirits that answered to him, and allies who stood beside him, and a position inside the most dangerous organization in the martial world that gave him access its enemies never had. He had a name, Ghostblade, and a wound signature, and a thread that ran from a farmhouse in the mountains to the association leader's private knowledge. He was not close. He was closer than he had ever been. Those are different things, and he knew the difference, and the knowing did not create urgency, it created patience. He had learned patience from his grandfather, who had spent 15 years trying to instill righteousness in a child who was not built for righteousness, who had given the child a name that was a hope instead of a description, who had loved him with the specific completeness of someone who knows exactly what they are loving and has decided the knowing does not change anything. He was going to find Ghostblade. He was going to find the reason. He was going to stand in front of the man who had made that wound, and he was going to do what needed to be done. Not out of fury. Fury had never been what moved him, but out of the cold arithmetic of a boy who said "damn" over his grandfather's body and then walked out and started collecting the pieces he needed. He was not done collecting.